a big privilege in welcoming Aditya. Aditya, thank you for joining us and thank you for being so thoughtful about making this space purposeful for this group today. Aditya today, of course, is the CEO of Piramal Foundation, a crossover leader himself who started his career with KPMG and then was with a startup internet company. And now, of course, for the last 2 decades and more has been in the sector, of course, first with Pratham and then with Piramal Foundation in many roles and many groups. Of course, when I look at the people who are logging in today, I also know that you probably overlap with Aditya in different spaces in the sector. And that's also goes to how Aditya has been an active proponent of leaders really showing the way in terms of building capacity for the sector. So thank you, Aditya, for joining us today. Very grateful.
Thank you so much, Archana. Thank you for that introduction.
Lovely. And so as we go in, while of course the topic is people practices, and we will get there very soon, folks, I promise. We thought that it would be an interesting one to just go back to Aditya's journey in itself, right? Because there's so much of who we are as a person and what my values are and what I think I and who I need to be as a leader that really shapes how we approach people practices. So we wanted to take a step back and pause and say, can we spend some time in being able to sketch Aditya's journey and then really deep dive into the people practices of at Piramal Foundation and how Aditya really looks at it. So Aditya, let's start with that, right? We'd love to go back in time. We always talk about childhood dreams and aspirations that we have, and how unfortunately many times the education system kind of waters down the dreams and the visions that we have had. So tell us a bit on, if you were to go back to your younger days as a child, as an adolescent, what were your dreams when you grew up, and how did education, all of that happen, and how did you land up in your first job? Like, what was that like?
Ah, uh, I work in education, so this is a bit embarrassing to start off with, but I didn't listen to any classes from third standard to 10th standard. I just looked out of the window all the time. And the only thing I aspired for was to play football. I should play football for 4 hours a day. And in fact, I was a rather truant student, unfortunately. So I've actually been rusticated from 3 different schools that I was in, much to my parents' unhappiness. And it was always because I conflicted with authority, I think. I didn't understand why the teacher needed so much authority, even if she was wrong. Now, when I look back at it, I can sort of spin it nicely and say, I was fighting for justice, or I was fighting for fairness. But at that time, no teacher wanted to hear any of that. I went to a school in which there was actually on the notice board a pin-up which said, it is hereby notified that from tomorrow, teachers will only be allowed to use a wooden ruler to beat children, and no more metal rulers will be allowed under any circumstances. So, it was can you even imagine? And this was in the 80s. And so I used to watch my friends, not having done a homework, or having done the homework but having got it wrong. And then they had to take their hand out. I don't know how many of you remember. You had to take your hand out like this, and the teacher would beat the hand and then beat it again. And then whatever you did, it was wrong. Because if you started crying, why are you crying? If you're not crying, what you're so brave is it that you can't cry? And so I watched a lot of this, and I just didn't think any of this made sense. It didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to those people. Someone had discriminate authority in the classroom. And therefore, it always sort of felt like there should be some better way of doing this whole thing. And so I came in conflict a lot with authority structures. And you realize that what happens in the classroom is what happens in society, right? If you don't have democracy in the classroom, you can't have it in society, because that's the first area where the child, if you don't have democracy in the family, you're not going to have it in society, because these are the first 2 units of socialization for the child. So I think that always stayed at the back of my mind when I was going through stuff. But typical middle class child. So, when I finished 10th and I went to do my college, and in the middle of my college, I realized I was in college during the times when Harshad Mehta was making a lot of money on the stock exchange. But it didn't turn me on. I didn't realize the purpose of that. And I sort of told my father I want to be in social work. And he said, "Who's going to pay your bills?" And I said, "Yeah, valid point." So I just quietly went back and finished my college. I did my CA as well. And during my CA, I realized, what the hell am I doing? And again, I went to my father and I said, "Listen, I don't think it makes sense." But he said, "Yeah, but who's going to pay for you? I mean, we can just about afford to pay for ourselves." And that got repeated again during my MBA as well. But I think finally, after a point, the calling was too much, and I just quit. And I made a deal with my dad that, listen, if the family is not doing well enough, I'll go back to the real world. But otherwise, I want to do what I'm passionate about, and that's how I shifted 22 years ago.
Lovely. And what did your parents say then? I'm curious on what was, because we always talk about a decision to join the social sector is not just an individual, it's like a family
Yeah.
decision. So how is that? How was that, and how
So
is
my parents had sort of heard this for a long time. All my friends had got bored of hearing it. But in spite of that, it's interesting how they responded. And they're extremely progressive parents on many other dimensions. But this, I think, was difficult, right? Because I mean, you want in the social circle, and you remember 22 years ago, there's no Teach for India, there's no Gandhi Fellowship, there is no social sector. Social sector is equal to Gandhi, Jola bag, go and live in the village. That's all, right? There's no professionalization, there's no ILSS, there's no ISDM, there is no Satwa Consulting, there is no Bridge Span, there are no large organizations. Nobody can imagine. They can't imagine how you're going to earn money. And so I think it was valid for them to be apprehensive. So my father kept telling everyone, no, my son is working in London only. He's just come back for a short holiday. Someone would come and tell him, no, but I just saw him the other day on the street. No, he's still working in London. He just came back for a holiday. So they took a long time to accept it. And finally, one day I had to sit them down and say, hey, listen, this is real. I think I'm going to be here for a year. But I took it as a sabbatical for a year. I said, I'm going to do it for a year. Then I said, I'm going to do it for 3 years. Then they said, okay, but are you going to be viable? And I wasn't viable till at least 5 years out. So it was very stressful for them. It was stressful for me. Middle of that, I got married. So it was stressful for my wife as well. So it was not easy.
Yeah. I think, and you the way you spoke about how, I think with time there's also been change, because we know that now when we talk to some of our crossover leaders, right, and we ask them about what prompted you to think of the sector, they say, my child. My son in high school told me that, saying, Papa, what are you doing? Like, do you want to do this in the social sector? Do you want to continue in the corporate sector? So it's almost a entire journey that our country has been on, also on the role of the social sector itself as a career choice.
Yes.
And so when you move to the social sector, Aditya, given that you've been considering it for a long time, what were some reinforcements and what were some surprises? Did you have any, like, surprises in terms of having looked at it from the outside and when you actually started working in the sector?
So I had worked in consulting. So I had worked really long hours and was reasonably successful. I had worked in investment banking, which is even longer hours and even tougher. And then I had worked for a startup, right? It was in the early internet days in 2000, which was crazy hours and crazy tough. And still, the work that I did in the social sector, which was my fourth job, was tougher than all three of them. So I think I just didn't expect it to be so difficult, physically, mentally, emotionally. It's not easy. I started my work in Kutch post earthquake. I was a volunteer there, and to see, I mean, it's one thing to intellectually, as a city bred child, say that you want to do something, but when you're there and you're eating dabeli every day, and your stomach is out and there's no doctor for a distance, and every day you're hearing about poverty and stuff like that, it just drains you. So I don't think I was aware of the mental health issues. I had no community of people to support me. So it was definitely difficult. And then there was huge arrogance, right? I've done an MBA, I've done my this thing, I've been successful, so I'm going to be successful here. But no MBA teaches you how to tell a mother not to abort her female child. No sales technique, no marketing program tells you how to convince a father not to get his 14-year-old daughter married. No program teaches you, what to do when you actually see child labor for the first time in your life. or traffic children. So, none of the skills I had, I suddenly found were actually useful. And that just bottomed out for me. I mean, it caused a lot of like, what the hell have I been doing for the last 7 years? I thought I was collecting skills and none of this is useful type of thing. So it was quite difficult, the transition. And of course, I didn't have the support mechanism that people today have. But I think even today, people find it rather difficult.
Oh, yes, definitely. I think one capacity building one that a lot in every group that I've been in the last 1 year, they talk about is that the whole space has been created for a mental health sabbatical, right?
Yeah.
And while, of course, there are some caveats around you need to have FCRA and all of that, but even that to be able to recognize that there's burnout and to have, have options like take a sabbatical because we often say that 5 years in the social sector, you age like about 12 years. And so that's because it's not just the hours, it's that energy that goes into it and that emotion. So definitely.
Yeah.
And so if you were to look at your entire journey, right? What and your journey looking back now over 2 decades, um, what would you say were some pivotal points that either reinforced something for you or or pivoted something for you over the 2+ decades in the social sector?
I was very lucky that I started in Pratham. Pratham today is a very large organization. Those days it was just in Mumbai and Delhi. And I started in 2002 in Pratham. And so I got some wonderful mentoring about, what does social change actually mean? What does building democracy actually mean? What does community mobilization actually mean? What does a movement actually mean? And but as a result, I mean, and so that was definitely, I think, having chosen Pratham was one of the best choices in my life because I really got an understanding of that. The only problem is I had to land up tearing up literally and throwing out all my MBA books on how the world works because the incentives for people to volunteer in corporate, I was taught that incentives, positions, expansion, job deepening, career planning, none of this is what makes a person volunteer to help build India. None of this is what helps a person volunteer. So the mechanics of how this works, I just didn't know. So I think that was definitely one portion. Probably the second was after about 4 5 years when I was in Pratham, when I'd sort of learned the ropes, and then I started an organization along with 4 5 friends called Kaivalya Education Foundation, where we worked on leadership development in the sector. That was a new experience again. I hadn't been an entrepreneur, although I'd been part of a program before, and that is the next level of difficulty. In the middle of Lehman Brothers and crashing, I was trying to raise money to say we need to do leadership development for principals of government schools on scale. And people are saying, how, not what are you smoking, but how much are you smoking? To imagine that government systems can change, to imagine that they will be open to leadership and they will drive change themselves inside government, and that you can do it on scale. None of these seem possible to us. But somehow, just from the experience that we had, we just knew that there were a lot of good people inside government and it really needed to happen. So I think that was the second big thing. And I did that continuously for 10, 12 years. And 3 years ago, I took on a role at the Piramal Foundation. And I think that was possibly the third discontinuity. Piramal Foundation works across education, health, water, and gender. And so I think it's a different role because you're not directly executing anymore, but you're a lot more responsible for institution building and a lot more responsible for building the leadership internally. So I think that was possibly the third and discontinuity for me.
Lovely. And this is all the professional milestones, etc., right? And I'm sure that alongside this, there was also other identities of life happening. And so, any reflections on that's today that you feel is at the core of who you are?
Yeah. I mean, as usual, like I think it's almost compulsory for any social sector person. I got married, I got divorced, I got married again, I had children. So I was bankrupt. I had to take money from my dad at the age of 38. So, all the personal ups and downs. I collapsed with mental health issues. I had to take a sabbatical for 3 months. I went for therapy for a year. So I did. I think it's almost all, these are all tick marks for 20 years in the sector. I don't know any one of my colleagues who survived without all this excitement, because all the questions that you ask ultimately affect you. So ultimately, you have to ask the question, what does being human mean? At least for me, that's what became the fundamental question. What does being human mean? What is my relationship with the people around me? Uh, why do I exist? Why am I born? And that's a very fundamental question, because you've got to draw boundaries between who you are and who another person is. So I can take, okay, 25,000 rupees salary every month, okay? And then let's assume the other person is earning 3,000 and can't send her daughter to school, and she's one of your staff. What are you going to do? Right? Are you going to keep? I mean, I would love to have my 25,000, or are you going to give it to her because she's your staff? You're meeting her. This is no longer someone who's distant. You're working with her every day, right? And so it gets extremely complicated. I think if you actually ask the questions, I think it gets very, very complicated. And I went through that cycle, but I think that's almost rite of passage. If you don't ask those questions, now I'm so much clearer, but I can see other people going through that churn and hopefully support them as they go through that churn.
Thank you for sharing that, Aditya. I think it's beautiful how you're talking about it with so much grace now, right? And it's a necessary journey that one has to go through, right? Like you said, because if you're not exploring those questions, then then in some ways you're not really doing the real work, right? Because that's the real work. So thank you for sharing that. Um, we could shift gears and to the Piramal Foundation um, and really the overall philosophy of people practices and how it really trickles down across the various people, functions, and so on. To get us started on this, right, in our conversations, and even from what we've seen at Piramal, there's a very deliberate definition of what you see as people practices philosophy. And that's at the root of, I mean, everything that you think, say, and do, right? So, could you share with us that philosophy that's like the anchor from where everything else is really stemming?
Yeah, I'll try and describe it, Archana. This is actually driven by the chairman himself. This is not specific to us as a management team. The Piramal Group itself, in its values, has humility and trusteeship. This is the corporate. So humility and trusteeship are not common values in a company. Excellence, you can imagine, there's customer orientation, all that sort of stuff. But humility, and these are not just values on the, on a board somewhere. You get caught out if you are um, not practicing these values. And trusteeship is about recognizing that all the skills that you have are in service of society. All the money that you have is in service of society. All the assets that you've given are in service of society. They're not in your service. So I think that same vibration which exists in the business also obviously permeates in the foundation. We've just used slightly different words, and we say compassion and seva bhav is extremely critical. But we've nuanced that a little bit more specifically. So, you'd imagine that everyone in the sector is, so what is so new about compassion or seva bhav? Obviously, anyone who's coming to the sector should have compassion and should have seva bhav, right? But I think we've nuanced it a little bit, defined it rather clearly, and gone really into depths of how do we behave and how do people experience us. And that's very, very critical. And that drives, because people practices can be thought of as, okay, what is your performance management system? What is your career plan? What is your, growth plan for people? What is your capacity development plan? What is your salary increase? It's not about that. It's about what is the experience. Obviously, all those are basic hygiene factors. You have to pay people. You have to have contracts. You have to be fair in that. What is your posh policy? All that is basic, right? Those are the people practices which are almost required anywhere. But then on top of that, what is the experience that I have as an employee? And I think we constantly fail at this and creating what our aspiration is. But at least what the aspiration is very, very clear. Do you experience compassion from the people around you? And are you helping them experience the same compassion?
That's beautiful. Do you want to share with us a little bit about the framework? And I know that there is a framework that really anchors that. So if we want to perhaps give our listeners a view of that to really center the conversation. Because I can tell you that from the numerous conversations that we have, even in the context of People Practices program, as well as all the leaders that we work with, that um, that it's not an HR in the social sector, right? It's not like what you said. It's not the HR functions of the employee life cycle and paint it with the social sector color. This is fundamentally different, and so would love to perhaps request you to share a little bit about that framework in itself as we center the conversation. And of course, there's also a message from the team in terms of folks as you're listening to this, if there are any comments that come to your mind or questions, do feel free to share. If they are in the context of the conversation we're having right away, I'll keep a look at it. And those are questions to it in a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so Archana, you'd imagine that if you're in the social sector, compassion should be a basic hygiene, and seva bhav should be basic hygiene. But honestly, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of social sector leaders that I have met have egos which are very, very large. And somehow, just because I care about trafficked children, I can shout at everybody. Just because I care about education and you don't care as much, I can pull you up. Just because I care about saving that mother and you didn't work hard enough to make sure that that happened, I can raise my voice. That somehow that seems to be reasonable because it almost seems to demonstrate that I have huge commitment for the final outcome. We don't accept the form of this thing. The first training that fellows go through, the first training that staff go through is on nonviolent communication, basic Rosenberg framework. And it's a really cathartic process if you actually do the OFNR in that. And so it's not about just what you care for in the community or, I'm a climate activist and therefore I care about the climate and I'm anti-corporate, I'm anti-government, I'm anti this, I'm anti that. I think we started the Gandhi Fellowship, right? So the point is Gandhi wasn't anti anybody, right? You just have to listen and understand that every person wants to do good in their life, but is stuck in a system or in incentives that are causing them to make poor choices. And if you don't tune in with compassion to that, and if you don't listen to them, and if you're not building bridges with them, can you actually build the country? Or does it cause further division? Let's even assume you're politically on the opposite political divide from me. Is shouting necessary and is it going to help anywhere? Or do I have to listen to you and try and find common ground? That is the democratic process, right? It is not of separating from each other. So therefore you cannot say, I've got Seva Bhav because I really care. Last 15 years, I've been fighting for child rights. Last 15 years, I've been fighting against sexual harassment of young girls. That's true. And how you come in here and how do people around you experience you, I think is very, very critical. So we sort of call it, what is it? Up, down, left, right, right? So what does your one down experience of you? Does she experience compassion, or is she experiencing that you're constantly just driving her, pushing her hard? She has a mental health problem, but you say, no, but it's very important. You come for this government meeting. And you can say, I have Seva Bhav, but if she's not experiencing your Seva Bhav, right? Similarly, your partners, which is your one side, right? On your left side, we call it a government or donors. What do they experience of you? Are they experiencing co-creation? Are they experiencing listening? Are they experiencing from you a sense of deeply understanding what they care for and empathizing for that and co-building with them? Even your supervisor, right? Is she experiencing empathy from you for understanding what she's trying to do, why she's making the choices? No, but it was very wrong of you to not pay that person's salary that day. Or why don't you try and understand how are you deciding what is right or wrong on behalf of another person? You don't know. You're not living their shoes. You're not living their life. You're not living that moment. So empathy leading to compassion, leading to sense of service to that person, and you only sense of service. And similarly, the fourth part is, you're right, which is what which is your own peers, right? Whether they're in the sector or whether they're in a larger organization that you're part of. So this is a framework that we use. I quickly pulled it up. Can you see it?
Yes, can see it.
Yeah. So so it's more than just up, down, left, right. The reds show the up, your manager, and even your two up, right? Which is your manager's manager. Are you able to proactively manage your manager, and do you understand what your two up is trying to do? Do you understand the expectations of your donors and your government? Do you feel the needs of the government officers you're serving? Do you experience a non-judgmental? Do they experience a non-judgmental partnership? Do your two downs feel inspired by the vision? So up, down, left, and right. Do you feel safe and cared for? Does your one down experience autonomy and support? Right? And what we call own teammates, right? Which is my peers, or if they report to someone else, they're called cousins. Do they experience a sense of partnership, or they experiencing you constantly trying to influence them, saying, "Nahi, aap theek se nahi kar rahe ho, yahi karo," type of thing. So this is a framework that we use, saying, is compassion being experienced every day by people around you? It's not about, do you care about health, education, water, livelihoods, gender, climate?
It's beautiful because it's like, even as we were talking ahead of the webinar, right, that very often seva is always understood as that we need to practice seva in our work with the communities. But how are we really showing up with the value of seva in our spaces as much as with the communities is something definitely think about. I'm curious on when we look at the people in Piramal, they are of course from different groups, right? Of course, there are some who come from the fellowship in itself, and so they go through the entire fellowship training, all of that. There are perhaps some others who join you, maybe within the social sector, and then there are some others. I know that particularly in the leadership, that you all have also been very successful at integrating some senior corporate leaders to lead in the Piramal way. So what happens then? How do you work with these very diverse pools of people to be able to really align them with how to how to show up this way, right? I think more than anything else.
So you're making an assumption that we're able to do that well. So that's the fundamental flaw.
Okay.
But what do we attempt to do?
Yeah.
So definitely we have four clear groups of people, right? We have people who are very deep domain experts in education, in health. So we have doctors. In water, we have hydrologists and, really deep domain people. Then we have deep social sector expertise who understand communities, mobilization, yevo. Then you have deep corporate expertise, which is how do you manage organizations, how do you build institutions, how do you get funds and stuff like that. So there are different groups of people within the organization, and we all have come with particular mental models in our mind. So it's not easy, right? But the common mental model that we use for everyone is what we call the X, Y, and the Z axis. And this is embedded in our conversations. It's embedded in our selection process, in the employee life cycle, in the performance management, in the learning and development, in the exit routines, in the promotions. Everywhere we use the same X, Y, and Z. So what is X? What is Y? What is Z? X is about what you have achieved. Right. So I got X number of girls who are out of school back into school. I got X number of village ponds rejuvenated. I got X number of ASHA workers to spot high risk pregnancies. Okay, that's the what. The Y axis is about how you did it. And this is the really critical thing, because I can get those ponds done, but I can scare the pants out of you and then do it. I can incentivize you and then do it. Right. I can guilt you and then do it. Or I can understand you and help you find meaning and growth and community and then do it. And these are two completely different. So the X could be the same, but the Y could be very different. In the early stages of your career, the X matters. But as you go up, you can say that early stage of career, 80% is X. But at my level, 80% is Y, because I'm not really able to achieve anything. The only thing I'm able to do is make sure that people feel I'm fair, I'm just, I'm transparent, I'm objective, I'm a listener. But none of the achievement is mine because someone else is doing something. But even someone, as a direct supervisor, it starts becoming, from 20% to 40% being Y. When you're a double, when you're supervisor, then it starts being 60%. And then more and more, it's about why, right? The Y axis. So it's not about what you do, but how you do it, which is the Y axis. And finally, the Z axis is the why do you do it, right? If you see when you spot a leader, I don't know whether you know the psychology of this, but a human being can actually spot whether a child is taught whether to trust or not trust a person. There's no evidence. You don't even know. There's a subconscious calculation because it's a safe. Is this person safe or is this person not safe? Trustworthy or not trustworthy? A 3-year-old child will be safe with certain people and stuff like that. And that comes from what is the meaning? Why do you do this? Do you do this for your own aggrandizement to show that you are the greatest person on the planet? And look at how important you are and this thing? Or do you do it truly out of a sense of service? Do you do it out of a sense of wanting to grow? Do you do it out of a sense of wanting to compete? Any of these senses, if it's even there 5% in you, it manifests in your leadership style. And people around you will say, नहीं ये जो कर रही है ना वो इसलिए कर रही है, right? वो दिल से नहीं कर रही है. And people want to follow people who dil se want to serve this country. And so the work that you need to do at higher and higher levels of leadership, in my experience, is less and less on X because you get people who are better than you at X, right? There are better doctors than you, there are better hydrologists than you, there are better curriculum developers than you. But how you do it, typically we're not trained. Even the best MBA programs don't train you enough on this. And why are you doing something? And how does that manifest in your choices? And how do people pick up that? Is very, very critical because that's where your values actually express themselves. So more and more the performance system lands up being at the Y and Z level as you go into senior levels. And so whether you're from the corporate world, okay, so your X will be great. Okay, so you're a domain specialist, your X is great. So people hate this because I'm a hydrologist. For 15 years, I've been an expert. Or, I'm a doctor, I'm a specialist in nutrition. For 15 years, I've been acknowledged. And you're telling me that I'm not strong enough. Yes, unfortunately, I'm sure we took you because you're very beautiful at your x-axis, but your y-axis, unfortunately, is going to be 50% of your score once you're 10 to 12 years out in the industry. 50% is going to come from y. It's not. So do your one-downs feel like you're a vidwan and want to teach? Or do your one-downs feel like you're here to learn with them and that you really care for them? What do your one-downs feel? That's very critical. Says, no, but I am an expert, I know so much. Does the government feel like they're diminished because you're walking into the room? Or does the government feel empowered when you're walking into the room saying he will help us find the answer? Right? Does a donor feel that you're competing with them to show off that you know something? Or does the donor feel that, hey, this guy is great, we can collaborate with him and create something more beautiful? So each of these matters more and more. And so therefore, it doesn't matter whether you're coming in from the social sector, corporate sector, or from the development sector. We call it, like you guys coined, I've heard it first from ILS saying corporate sector crossover, but we call it social sector crossover as well. Because people who come from other organizations are not used to y-axis. And the academics and domain crossovers as well. Because even they're not used to y-axis because they were previously judged just on did you understand that for nutrition, when you have this particular circumstance in this particular geography, you have to do this. That's necessary, but that someone else who's younger than you is going to be smarter and beat you very soon.
Yeah, lovely. And so this is super helpful to have, right? Like the understanding of the XYZ axis as well as how, as we look at an organization at each level, there are different things that become more important in itself. There are questions that talk specifically to this, right? So I thought we could look at some of them. One question is around, that if one to have these values, sometimes it's hard to talk about these values, right? The person saying, I'll read out the question as is and then we can pick it up. It's often challenging to quantify values like compassion. How do we look at whether compassion is truly being felt by the team every day? And what indicators can we look for to ensure that the sense of empathy is really translating into action. And so, if you were to widen it a little bit, right, Aditya, I'm curious on how do you teach people to also live this, because it's one to understand it, but then there is a translating this understanding into habit and practicing it, right? So would love to just get some insights on that.
Sure. So there's no point talking about, because no one's going to listen if you talk, right? They have to experience this first themselves. I want to give you an example that our mentor and coach gave us, right? He was an ex-startup person who worked at the Taj for a very long time. And so he was the person who trained the people at the Taj in Bombay who stayed back when the terrorists attacked and protected their guests. Right? If you remember, they were like really odd. I mean, I would have just run out and protected myself, but they protected their guests even at the risk of their own life.
Yeah, and they all stayed till the end. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So now how do you create that? And he tells us about that, right? And he tells us, now how do you so it's a deep psychological thing, right? I mean, because that's not a skill. Like I can go to IIM Ahmedabad or I can go to ISB and I might still not learn this skill. And then I could be someone else and you don't know this. So first thing is to identify that is important for your organization, right? Now, once you identify that, then it happens at every level. It happens at the selection process. It happens at the evaluation process. It happens in the L&D process. Everywhere you can track it. So the starting tool that we use, which I would really recommend to all the people on this call, is NVC, Nonviolent Communication, Marshall Rosenberg. It's a very simple. There are 4 tools that we use. We use NVC. We use active listening, which is Carl Rogers. It's a 30-page book which costs 1,500 rupees, which I've been reading for the last 20 years. I mean, you'd imagine what is listening. I mean, that's the simplest skill, but it's the most complicated skill, right? And Carl Rogers has just distilled it. It's a badly typeset 30-page book, but it's still worth 1,500 rupees, every bit of it. And so we teach NVC, active listening, social emotional literacy, and cognitive based compassion training. So these 4 modules are all across the organization at various levels, depending on which stage you are in your own personal transformation journey. And we're not just telling you to read the book. These are actual life examples. So let's assume Archana just joined the organization. You'll go through a 3-day NVC workshop. Day 1 is on O, which is observation. Day 2 is on feeling. Day 3 is on needs and requests. So you have an irate employee who's unhappy that she didn't get promoted. What are you going to do? And you'll do a skit and it'll be videoed and you will actually get feedback and you will reflect against a tool, not even get feedback. You'll watch your own video and reflect. What do you think the other person is experiencing as you just suddenly squirmed? Do you think she's feeling like she's heard? Do you think she's feeling empathized with? Right? And so you learn to observe your own actions because you're seeing it on video. That you've crossed your legs and you're leaning back and you're rolling your eyes. And so she's saying, "I'm not feeling heard," right? And so you actually have to practice the skill of nonviolent communication. Similarly, active listening, it clearly has 4 steps. You have no choice. Are you synthesizing and playing back to the person what you just heard? So there are 4 steps. And so that practicing of that skill again and again, emotional literacy, we find people have very limited. If I ask you, how are you feeling? Good, not so good. That's not, you need a vocabulary which is more than that. अच्छा लग रहा है, बहुत अच्छा था workshop. But there's more to emotion than अच्छा या बुरा. That's the top level. But there's more to it than that. Are you feeling anxious? Or are you feeling fear? That level of nuance you are never taught. And so therefore, when your literacy is weak, then the ability to go to compassion is very high. So between these 3-4 tools and a lot of training, in fact, so many people at the moment, there are 30 plus 30 senior leaders in 2 different locations going through, of the top 150 people in the organization, going through this training, right? And this will be for the second and for the third and for the 4th time, because there's just no limit to how you can use this. So we've made it into tools, we've made it into very workshop skills practice that you can practice. And then, of course, not only if Archana joined the organization and we're doing this thing, and suppose we did a trial round, you can tell me, Archana, did you experience a sense of service from me? Right? During this call, I can ask you, did you experience that you felt heard and that I was here to serve you? Right? So that's the
Yes, yeah.
that's the question I will debrief with at the end of this call for myself.
Beautiful, yeah. It's lovely. As someone who's um, engaged a little bit with some of these trainings through, when we've had people from that network come and do this with us, that practice is what really gets us, right?
Yeah.
And that practice and observation of practice and reflection on practice to be able to really say, it's not just what we're talking about it, but actually what we're doing and how people are experiencing it. Yeah, very, very powerful. I was looking at some of the questions, and there are two questions which perhaps uh, are interconnected, right? One is someone asked us, given that Seva focuses on selfless service, how do you balance this with the needs of a leadership in a resource constrained environment? And we had Vikas who shared about, sometimes we witness that to achieve what X-axis outcome is, there's been so much push from stakeholders, donors, um, that sometimes ultimately, that's the what the reporting really asks for, even at the cost of psychological safety of the employee. How do you approach it at Piramal? And in fact, and his questions also, what are some safeguards can we put? Do we need to put around that? Because um, sometimes the ecosystem expectations are still around the X much more than the Y and the Z.
Yeah. So, although the two questions are similar, they are slightly different, Archana. So, I'll take them one at a time.
Sure.
So, the first one is to define what Seva is. There's a definition that we use. We also started with Seva is equal to selfless service. Seva is not equal to selfless service for us. Because once you say selfless service, then we are just finished, right? Because that's what my grandmother told me was Seva. And so we're defining compassion. Seva is equal to compassion. Compassion is a very specific thing, and Seva is a very particular thing. So, a particular thing for us, it is a warm-hearted desire to alleviate suffering of the person in front of me. So, it's a very specific definition. Warm-hearted. So, is Archana experiencing warm heart from me? Right? It's a desire to alleviate suffering. It is not even action to alleviate suffering. Is she experiencing that I want to help her learn something so that she's able to alleviate her suffering, right? And it is to alleviate suffering, which means I have to tune into what is Archana suffering from at the moment, right? So which means I have to actively listen to that suffering. Then I have to want to alleviate it. Then I have to have a warm heart in it, not a judgment of it. So it's a very, very specific definition that we use internally. So there's no selfless service at all. It is not selfless service. We're using a definition of compassion. And seva is a warm-hearted, not just desire, but followed with action. Not just a warm-hearted desire to alleviate suffering, but followed with action. Because I can have a desire, and I need not even, my desire is you will experience it, without my even talking to you, sometimes because I'm just here, right? Without even any action. So inaction can also be a sense of compassion because I don't know what to do, but I feel that warm heart for you, and I hope that your life's troubles are moved away and that you are in full joy. Or I act a little bit and also help that happen. Because sometimes we think only if you act, only then it is equal to this thing. So we separate these two words and it's a very specific definition. So in that context, therefore, the two questions will get reframed. Right. So yes, there is stress between outcomes constantly and this. But the question becomes again, go up, down, left, right. So donor wants outcomes. Yes. So, and if he doesn't get outcomes, if the donor representative doesn't get outcomes, her promotion gets this thing, or her having bet on you and sold it to her boss gets compromised. Are you tuned into what she's anxious about? Right? Are you tuned in? And you want to alleviate that? Does she experience that you want to alleviate and you're going to try and alleviate everything for that? So she has to experience that. She doesn't have to experience x-axis of outcome, but she has to experience that these guys did everything possible. Similarly, I have a colleague her mother is in hospital, but the donor visit is happening tomorrow. Now, it doesn't matter whether she actually goes for the visit or not. It doesn't matter whether your outcome. So I don't care about what happens. What I care is about how it happens. Right? Because once the donor visit will happen, it'll be good. Sometimes it'll happen, it'll be bad. Sometimes you'll decide to go despite your mother. It may be a good idea. Sometimes you'll decide not to go. That's not the point. The final choice by the other person who's standing in front of you is not the point. What you have control over, you do not have control over the person in front of you, whether they're the donor or whether they're your staff. They are independent agents who are going to express their own values in every situation. All you are is here to listen to them and see whether, yes, so now your mother is in this thing. I'm sorry, this is really the situation. I don't know what to do. And can we talk through? This donor is also important and your mother is also in hospital. And you need to talk about it. At the end of that, you don't know what decision is going to come. If you go into that conversation saying, I'm going to convince her to go, she's a lazy bum, she always gives excuses, she's going to experience that. That's what's not allowed. Right? And if you go to the donor and you say, my God, this guy is so unempathetic, he just doesn't understand field reality, that's a judgment. There's no warm-heartedness in that. There is no desire to alleviate suffering in that. So it's a question of how do you show up in the conversation? It's not about what you finally find. You might achieve the outcomes or not. Finally, you might ask her to go or not. I mean, she might go for the donor visit or not. That's not what's so important. What's important is how do you show up at that conversation?
Beautiful. It's bringing me to think about in terms of time and places where a leader is at, right? Any any guidance that you'll provide or any reflections that you've had in terms of um, where could leaders spend more time to be able to cultivate this? Where are spaces that leaders need to be more at to bring this alive? Any both in terms of is there any guidance that's provided as well as are there any just reflections from what we've seen different leaders do? Because I think then that being in touch with that person is so important, right? Whether it's a donor, whether it's a team member, or whether it's a client. So just curious on that.
So we've honestly embedded it into our systems, right? So which means your performance management system, you'll have 3 KRAs which are set on your x-axis, but you'll also have 3 KRAs on your y-axis. Your x-axis KRAs will be, get X number of schools done, get X number of middle managers, leadership development, get X number of ponds filled, whatever like that. But your y-axis is going to be a debrief of those 8 relationships that we saw. And you pick up your 3 weakest relationships. My boss thinks I'm a slacker. Okay. My peer thinks I'm difficult to work with. My donor thinks I'm argumentative. Okay. Now they may be right, they may be wrong. But the only person who you can control in the world is yourself.
Yeah.
So if this is the pre-test, since we all like pre-tests and post-tests in this sector, and we like control groups and treatment groups, now the only person who you have control over is yourself.
Yourself, yeah.
And your setting saying that when you start the year in April, this person thinks I'm a slacker. Is there evidence to believe I'm a slacker? Probably these 3 incidents. Whatever it is, I have no control over that. Now I have to, or whatever, this person seems always anxious about me, or doesn't seem to trust me, whatever it is. There is some problem in the quality of the relationship between you and me, which is suboptimal. It is not care, compassion, and community. Anything less than care, compassion, and community has opportunity for improvement. Right? And so any gap in that, we know that children's learning can improve, we know that maternal mortality can reduce, but do we know that care, compassion, community is the core of what we are doing? And if that is suboptimal, you set goals even on that dimension. Think, I want not believe I'm a taskmaster, but I'm so proud of it. No, sorry, it's going to come up in your y-axis. You have to set. And then when you're setting goals, what are the actions you're going to do? How are you going to evaluate those actions? Whom are you going to get feedback from? What would you like them to perceive you, and what are the 3 words you would like them to perceive you to be by the end of the year? So when you go through this cycle, it gets embedded into your performance management system. And
Hmm.
therefore, when you're reviewing at the end of 6 months and then 12 months, you get not only your X, but your Y. And at senior
Why
level,
is it?
you look at X because the X is done by someone else.
Yeah,
Really,
yeah.
the Y that's done by you.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious on how do you look at this for Z? Because we've spoken about X and Y. And one thing that, when we talk to many leaders, they tell us is um, as we look at leaders who lead teams, how much of their goals are their goals and how much of their goals are like composite goals. So
Yeah.
and as we were talking about how Z could be more in senior leaders, curious on how do we even bring alive the Z? And two is with leaders who have many of the team goals and then they are responsible for something. What is that? What are some reflections on that?
Yeah, great question. So we call it non-cumulative KRAs, which means I cannot cumulate. I cannot say, okay, this person got 20 girls into school, this person got 20 girls, 16 girls, this person got 4 girls, and this one got 40 girls. So I got my 100 girls into school. This cannot be a supervisor's. This is accumulation, right? This is a typical sales technique of just accumulating numbers. So I get no credit for those 100 girls who got into school. I instead get credit for, did I create an enabling environment by working with the government to make this happen? Did I create the right tools so that the person could do these tasks, so that the 4 people could? Did I create the right team environment so that this happened? So the KRA of the supervisor is substantially different. It is not accumulation. And then when it goes to the next level, again, it cannot be accumulation of, okay, now if all these people created their own environments, what did you do additionally? So every time the question is, what is your value added? It cannot be. So supervision, you get 20% KRA on your X-axis, right? So therefore, you're forced to do other stuff. And I think that itself, inherently, the non-cumulative KRAs help you focus on saying, okay, what is my real value added? So therefore, calling up someone and saying, boss, did you put those girls into school? And, bumboing them for having done only 14 when you should have done 20. You're not going to get this thing. You have to tune in and say, okay, did I select the right people into this role? Did I provide them the right training? You have to go into a reflective process. So I think the performance management system affects our behaviors enormously. So how you select, how you performance manage, then affect, because everyone wants to do leadership development. But if you've selected the wrong people and you're incentivizing the wrong behavior, then leadership development is quite useless. So in the selection process itself, see, if you come with 15 years of having worked for Save the Children in child rights, what am I going to evaluate about your X-axis? I mean, you must be bloody good, right? There's nothing much to evaluate. The only differentiation is going to be in your Y-axis. So the questions will be around, okay, so there was a choice between a donor, like you said, between a donor and an outcome. What choice did you make and how did you reflect on that choice? Why did you make that choice? Why would someone else have made a different choice? So that's when you understand the person's Y-axis. And then the Z, finally, we don't evaluate the Z, only X and Y are evaluated. Z is more a personal career planning process to help you find meaning in life. It says, what is your service to the world in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years? How is this platform of the Piramal role helping you achieve that goal? What gaps do you think exist in you to be able to achieve that goal? And how can I enable you to, how can I help in any way for you to achieve that? And that might therefore precipitate a role change. It might even precipitate for me to tell you, hey, go out and work for another organization for a few years. It might precipitate anything. But this is to make sure, because you cannot have the resilience. My learning in the sector is that the resilience required is berserk, right? Because you're going to be abused by the government, you're going to be abused by the community member, you're going to be abused by the donor. All the time, the resources available are always short. So unless it's really meaningful, the typical corporate way of thinking that achievement can motivate, the achievement is too little, and achievement doesn't happen consistently, and achievement is not in your hands. So achievement as a motivator instead of meaning as a motivator. So this is my platform, this is my life's work. So the fundamental question for me as a leader is, I hate the word human resources. I came from the corporate world. The human is not a resource. The human is a being.
Yeah.
Right? It's a being. It's not a resource. It is a natural resource. It's a human resource. It's not a human resource. So the first question is, in the Y-axis is you see certain leaders whose, at least when I interview, one of the things I look for is are you here when I'm interviewing, right? So you see that there are certain people who need to achieve so much themselves that they're recruiting other people into their mission, right? Oh, I have to get you because this is so important. Are you here to serve that person's goals? Are you a platform for that person's aspirations? Or is that person a tool for your aspirations? And I think that fundamental difference, if you don't transition, that you're here in service of others, that you're a platform for the other to achieve her aspiration. Now, that means I can't do everything and everything, but I have to check whether Archana's aspirations are similar to mine and then whether I can be of service to her in a platform. But if I'm not going to be to convince you to pay you more wage and to give you a motivational speech to come here when you. So I refer a lot of people who come to us to my friends who work in other organizations. You're really interested in girls? There's a fantastic organization. It's called Educate Girls. We will never do work as beautiful as them. It's just not worth it. We will never be as deep and committed as they are to this issue. So it's better to refer you there because that seems to be the one. But no, I'm not as sure. I want to evaluate 2, 3 things. Yeah, then maybe this is the right platform for you. So Z is about how do you build your meaning making in this sector as to why you're doing it. Because if you're doing it for achievement, I think people will spot it and you won't be able to cause the change that's required. I mean, when you see Gandhi, what was he doing it for? Was he to become Gandhi? To become recognized? To win Magsaysay? Nothing. I don't think so. I think he was a lunatic. He really bloody cared about people. He really, at least it felt to me like he really cared about the freedom of this country. That's what it felt like to me from his readings and from the work that he did with himself. And I think that's the opportunity that each of us has. Are we able to communicate that sort of commitment, or are we caught in our own egos?
Yeah, yeah. Beautiful, because we live in a world where these are formal education is so on achievement, and even within that is such a narrow definition of achievement.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was a question. Actually, I'll come to that. Um, what you shared with me brought up some themes, right? One was you spoke about how when some people apply to you and you, in your conversation with them, you actually feel that, hey, they may be better suited somewhere else. Um, and you also briefly touched upon how sometimes people have served their time in with Piramal and you feel like now they actually need to be elsewhere, right? Can you share a little bit about how it's been? What are some lessons? What are some, and maybe some examples of people who left the organization, um, and and mainly from the lens of, when we talk to people in the sector, sometimes even people who've experienced seva from the organization when they were there, if when they're talking about the time when they left the organization, they feel like, wow, what was just that, right? So I'm curious on, when could you give us a few examples of how that plays out when somebody tells when somebody told you that they want to leave, or maybe an example where you actually said, hey, maybe you should go there.
I think they're two different things, right? I mean, one is that, I mean, while we might put this out as a philosophy, the final experience of the individual is going to be dependent. People join organizations, people leave managers, right? So the particular manager who's finally managing you, you might not experience that seva bhav because she's on her own journey and you need a particular type of experience, right? And again, my mentor and coach who used to be at the Taj, I love the example he used to give, right? He says, why is the Taj able to charge a premium? The room size is the same 15 by 10 as every other thing. But instead of paying, 3,000 or 4,000 for a room, you pay 10,000 at the Taj, right? Why do you pay that premium? And he used to say, it's about the experience that you create. So I said, what is the experience? He says, right from the point at which you enter the Taj, someone is going to open the door. It's a Darwan. He's going to open the door. What is his SOP? It is to open the door and let you in. Maybe it is to say, welcome, sir. Welcome to the Taj. But what does he make you feel? Does he make you feel welcome? And if you've noticed, when you go to the Taj, you feel welcome. When you go into the Vistara, I at least feel welcome. When I go into Air India, I don't feel that welcome. Right? There is a difference in how you feel. Right? Otherwise, the service is going to get the x-axis is the same. I'm going from Bombay to Delhi. But the experience is because of which I'm tempted. I'm hoping that the 7 o'clock morning flight, even if it's 750 rupees extra, I go by Vistara rather than by Air India because I want to feel good, right? So it's about the experience. And I think we are not able to consistently, in a small organization, if you are just if you're about 50 people, which is what one founder, 7 people reporting to the founder, and 7 more people reporting to that. So it's a 7 into 7 type combination. If you're 50 people, 7 into 7 plus one leader, you know every person, and the experience is directly with the founder, right? And therefore, then everyone is ultimately joining or leaving the founder because the managers hardly matter. But as soon as you go to the next level, where you have not just the band one who are serving the communities, but the band two who are project managers, 7 people into 7 people. But then you start having more, sort of program managers at the senior level. You start becoming a 350-person organization, or then you start becoming 350 into 7 again, which is 2,250-person organization. I think at that level, the experience that people have in an organization is very, very scattered. This is a problem, right? Vistara is able to consistently give you that experience. Taj is able to consistently give you that experience. Indigo is also able to consistently give you an experience, whether you like it or not. It's able to give you an experience. But creating that service experience, I don't think we've done enough work as a foundation. I think there's a long way to go. And so, therefore, there are several people who are very irate and therefore leave the organization, saying, we only hear about this in talk, but we don't experience it. Now, some of that may be their supervisor, some of that may be the system, some of that may be the context, some of that may be themselves. There are some people who are just inherently depressed and believe that the world around them is wrong. But I handle a lot of these grievances. So I think that's just part of the game. It's like at the Taj also, some people are unhappy that the food is not good. And some people are unhappy that the room was not clean. It's just your commitment as leadership to keep on improving that experience for people and saying, okay, I am committed to a sense of service. We will put in place the systems and the process for that. But then our new manager is going to come in who's going to head the 50 people, and people like him versus the old manager. So then some drama is going to happen, or some manager's manager is going to come in and drive it in a new way. He has a very corporate attitude. I don't like it. And it's going to happen. So there is going to be, we're all human beings. We want a particular experience. We want love, compassion, understanding, empathy. We don't get it all the time. So I think that's the reality. Vistara, at least after 2 hours, you leave. You're in the organization, you're 12 hours a day, you're together for 2 years. It's very difficult to consistently create that experience for you.
Yeah. Got to say that from November, when all Vistara flights are being flown by Air India, it'll be interesting to see what's the experience that's the culture alignment that happens. And so, if I come back to what you just shared, right, Aditya, in terms of a size of, let's say, 40 times 50, where the founder still knows everyone. And then as we grow, then the scale changes. There are more leaders in the organization. That's actually the stage where many organizations are in the sector today, right?
Yeah.
And so, what would you say were some, and now you all have gone to the next level of growth, right? And so, if you had to look back at this journey of from the first circle, for lack of a better word, right, to say, okay, thing of about 50 to growing to about 200 and then 2,000, what would you say are some things for people to keep in mind? Maybe any failures that you had in terms of we did this, didn't really work, and maybe one thing that you feel like, hey, you know what, because we did this, it saved us a lot of time and effort later.
Yeah, so we made lots of mistakes, right, Archana, in inducting corporate people, in inducting people with more experience, in promoting the wrong person, in not promoting in time. And I think over time, at one point, I think in that stage of the organization, I was spending 55% of my time on leadership development. There was a good 4-year period because that period was really tough because who are the leaders you're spotting? What are the systems that you're setting in place? What do you stand for? Because everyone has their own style and one person is working in Assam, one person is working in Gujarat. You don't even have a common experience as an organization. Do you allow the manifestation of your individual style, or is there something common, irrespective, that you have to experience? We made a lot of mistakes at that time. I was a little too, sometimes I was too laissez-faire and allowed too many experiences. People said, I like Gujarat, but I don't like Rajasthan. I like Rajasthan, but I don't like the Balmer, this thing, So who is that as an organization? we made a lot of mistakes. But at the same time, if you on day one itself you say no, this is what the rules are and stuff like that, also is a problem, because then new people are not coming in and you're not refreshing what the organization stands for and what its values are. But I think at some point, so I mean, I think you will make mistakes. The question is, are you spending the time required on that choice? And I think the advice I would have is that there's this disproportionate amount of time you have to spend on people at one point. Now you'll say, boss, at that time only is the fundraising problem as well. And that time only people are doing, and that's the right thing. That's why organizations don't scale at a particular level, because that's the time at which, and that's when you get tested as an individual, because you're not willing to delegate. Then what happens is people are still, your two downs are still coming back and reporting to you, saying that this person whom you put here is an idiot. You promoted one of the 5 people here, but the remaining 4 are not willing to report to that person. So I think these are just part of the game. Do you have, so one, are you spending time? 2, do you have a reflection coach, mentor who has more experience in this? 3, do you have a community with whom you can share your pains and tribulations? So I will share more of process indicators rather than what to do, because what to do in each context is very different. But are you reflecting yourself? Do you have a coach to help you reflect even more? Do you have a community with which to share, unburden, but who also helps you turn the mirror inward? If you don't have those things, life is probably more difficult, and it's very, very painful, because you keep getting feedback from everyone saying, okay, you're not good enough. Okay, chalo, I have to change it. I'm sorry. And just go ahead. And I think the willingness to do that personal work yourself is very, very important. A lot of people come in, I've heard some people, even a young fellow, I've heard this at every age group. I've heard it at 21, 31, 41, and 51. The same question. I came here to help children. I didn't come to change myself. And I tell them, and this is the wrong organization. Uh, so, again, my coach helped me frame this as, are you here to harvest what you already know, or are you here to grow? If you're here to harvest because you believe you've already cracked it in the corporate world or in the academia or in the social sector, and now, I come from Plan International, I handle much bigger projects than this, and so you have to listen to me. Of course, that could be true, but are you, you might be even, I'm assuming that 80% of the time you know the answer, but are you here to harvest or are you here to grow? And if you're here to harvest, it's the wrong person, because you're not here to grow. He says, no, but I already know so much. Why don't I just grow the other people? No, it's only about your growth. So I think that attitude of investing in yourself to change and lead is very, very critical. And if you don't get a bunch of leaders who are willing to do that personal work, in community, I mean, you have to see the painful process. We've subjected ourselves to 8 of us sitting in a room for 5 days in a row with feedback from an external facilitator, individual coaching. Every one of us has had a therapist practically, because, invariably once you do that, you realize there's some childhood, your mother didn't allow you to do something, and therefore you have problems. Are you using all these tools? It's not just a coach. I think you need at least 4 people. You need one who's a psychologist. Almost all of us, unfortunately, have difficult parenting or difficult circumstances, which nobody taught us how to process. You need a coach for very specific skills. You need a sense of community with people you can share and say, boss, I'm just tired of this shit, right? And you need a mentor who's like, 20 years above you saying, don't worry, life sorts itself out. So do you have those people in your life? Because very often, we're trying to be this lone warrior. Luckily for me, I'm like a lazy bum. So I just get all these people and I say, okay, I'm an idiot, but tell me what I should do better.
Aditya, there are a bunch of questions on the chat window as well. I wanted to see if you want to take a minute to see them, anything that you wanted to pick up in particular, and or I can also do that.
Yeah, well, I'll leave it to you.
So one question is about the couple of questions are around the diversity of the people we have in the social sector organizations, right? One person's asked us, Aditya, a very pointed question. And Aditya, do you think elitism is emerging in the social sector? Few organizations hire staff only from tier 1 colleges, enjoy some kind of privileges, or is it just gossip? There's another question also around how do when you look at different when we look at people from different backgrounds in the team, what are some learnings in terms of how do we make everyone feel included when we're working together, right? So I know these are two different themes in itself, but the question is around if I were to kind of pull these two together and say, what are we seeing about the diversity of the people in the sector today, and what could we do to be able to be conscious to have the diversity? Because ultimately, if we get into too many people just like us, then we've lost the whole plot, right? So
yeah. Again, the question on elitism, I'm going to reframe in a way in which I'm comfortable answering it. So I don't know about the social sector as a whole, because these are just broad patterns. Is India bad? This thing good? BJP bad? Congress good? These are the only thing I have control over is myself. Am I elitist in my choices that I am making? That's what I have control over, and I have 100% control over. Right. So maybe it's bad, maybe it's good, but so then if it matters to me, then I have to join an organization which is more able to handle the class differences that are inherent in India. First of all, just remember that just like we created Dalits, we also created field workers. What does field worker mean? And by definition, it's like blue collar worker. We created something called field worker. So there's an inherent class system even in the social sector which seeks to remove these things. So yeah, so unfortunately, some of that is true. The question is, what am I doing about it? So we don't have field workers. We have Gandhi fellows. And in fact, they get more bhav than the British staff. So if it matters to you, reverse it. Do something about it. And yes, there is diversity and difference. I have a colleague, in fact, you know him as well, who joined from ILSS, right? Ishmeet, and he's worked at Coke, he's worked at Unilever, he's worked at the best companies in the world, which are extremely good at diversity. And he still argues that the diversity here is just berserk. And I think that's the beauty. See, we should teach this internal thing called allophilia. It's very beautiful. You should read it, Archana, if you've not. This thing comes from a Harvard. Yeah. So how do you deal with diversity? And it actually gives you tools to deal with diversity. Because diversity is either a stress or diversity is an opportunity. The fact that you and I are different. Do you want you and me to be the same? I don't want you and me to be the same. Because then life is so bloody boring. You're going to make the same choices as me, this thing, that thing, right? Now, cognitively, I understand that. But when you and I have to work together, then I'm wishing that you have the same opinion as me. Or I'm going to try and convince you. That's really stupid. Because you come from a different gender, you come from a different background, you come from a science background, I come from a commerce background, she comes from an arts background. So inherently, diversity you have to look at either as a stress or as an opportunity, right? I'm an English-speaking urban kid, you're first generation learner, I'm third generation college goer. These are all inherent differences between us. And if you see that each person has an opportunity, so inherently is the culture of learning from diversity or trying to create homogeneity, saying that my point of view is superior. And that's again painful. It involves reflection. But if you want to create a plural society, and I can't even create a plural organization, I want to create a democratic society, but I can't even create a democratic organization. I want my voice heard in my country, but I'm not even able to hear the voice of someone in my organization. How is it going to happen? So this is the internal work that I have to do if I really do. India doesn't become democratic. I don't know if you remember this quote of Gandhi when he was resisting Swaraj. And he argues that I don't think there's any purpose of Swaraj because we'll merely replace the white man with the upper caste. And so what is needed is deep personal work in order for the upper caste to also recognize that he's just a different level of oppressor. But that's the personal work required from each of us. So that plurality is difficult, but that is the work. Yeah. So you come in thinking that you're working on gender. Actually, you're not working on gender. You're not working on climate. You're not working on sustainability. You're not working on public health. You're not working on road safety. You're working on yourself. Yeah. you think, no, I really love road safety. But the sad reality is, whichever one of these things that you do, you're ultimately here to build India as a democracy,
Yeah.
plural democracy. And plural democracy, I didn't experience in my childhood inside my family. I didn't experience inside my classroom. I didn't experience inside my college room. I didn't experience inside my, which means I have to first even try to understand what that means.
Yeah.
What is that experience of a plural democracy? That means each person's voice is equally valid. You're so pissed off that inside the organization it's not happened, but a Mahadalit has not been heard for the last 3,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And doesn't get an ILSS conference to even come and ask the question. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so tune into that person's pain
Yeah.
and figure out how you're going to solve your life so that you can solve hers as well.
Yeah. Deeply profound. Folks, I do want to say that having, even as we did the people practices program twice and we talked to people, like what Aditya said, that, that sometimes people say they came here to work on education, not on oneself. I will say that it's been a journey for us to also say that the people practices is as much, if not so much, about work on ourselves and getting people to work on ourselves as a collective, and then we'll figure out the formula for uh, talent engagement and development. And um and and I'm, and I'm saying this as someone who's seen the questions that came into the webinar, in terms of, for any of the technical things, they are important, not to underscore them. However, what we've seen is that if we're able to do this inner work, there are enough of people and Google and AI who give us those that we can then contextualize, right? So I wanted to kind of set that in context, given the diversity of the people who really joined us today. Other than, as we're talking about people practices within the organization, I'm curious on um, do you have a people HR team, and how do you look at, in order to bring this alive, what is the role of that team and how will that team work with the wider organization?
The program team is responsible fundamentally for HR. The HR team is not responsible. That's the fundamental thing. You can't say that, okay, I'm having a problem with this staff member. Please go counsel her and bring her back. It's your job. That is your job. That is your non-cumulative KRA.
Yeah.
Right? And so we do have a people function, but that function is for helping reach out and get more talent. It's for handling the regulatory functions, contracts, systems, things like that. So that's the more base, keeping the engine running, making sure your salary is paid on time, making sure gratuity is paid on time, medical insurance is paid on time, and stuff like that. So the L&D function is based inside the programs. It's your job as a leader to do that.
To be able to do that. Yeah.
Build your leaders.
Yeah. And in fact, which is why I deeply resonate with that, right? In fact, even in our work, we found that it's the leaders and the managers who are, I mean, that is our job. That is what we're responsible for, and not alienating it and saying, okay, there's going to be one team that's going to be looking at it. And so whatever we do, how do we do that as our core work and not as an add-on, as a housekeeping that we need to look at, right?
Once that becomes 1/3 of your career, automatically you'll do it.
Yeah, correct, exactly.
So, I seem to be quoting Gandhi again and again, but I think he's just such a interesting person. So, especially in this context, because he says, don't ever hope to build systems so good that people don't have to be good. And I find that very provocative, right? Because you can have everything perfect in the system, but ultimately human beings have to be good. And we're trying to avoid that somehow by providing incentives, disincentives, process, AI, whatever.
Yeah.
To be a good human being, you have to be. There's no choice. Training, leadership, ultimately you have to be a good human being. You can try and avoid it only X amount, and you have to create other good human beings. There's no choice. And that starts with yourself being some level of doing that work. Yeah.
And so as we draw to a close, we could keep this going on and on. I'm curious on if with this understanding and lens of seeing people practices itself, if you were to look at the sector, right, like say over the last decade or so, what is giving you hope? And what do you think are some areas that we've totally not yet focused our energies on while this is super important?
Much more than hope, Archana. I mean, sector is just so vibrant. I mean, you have to remember that I came 20 years ago. There were no fellowships. I couldn't join TFI or Gandhi Fellowship to get inducted into the sector. People looked at me and there was no crossover program. They said, CA, MBA, what the hell are you going to do here? There was a sense of judgment. There was no ILSS to help transition. Pays were pathetic. So pathetic that I had to keep taking a month off to go and work in the real world to come back and do that. Whereas pay now, even if it is low, it is not, you can at least live. In that day, I couldn't even live. So it was much, much different. So I finally got a sponsor, someone to sponsor me because I couldn't afford to live on the 20,000 rupees that was being paid to me. So I think so. You get more pay, you can be inducted. This being professionalized as a sector much more. So therefore, there are career tracks. Your parents are not like saying, "What the hell are you smoking?" Because parents know that more and more this is becoming real. So I think the sector has really, really evolved and is having more and more resources to make this possible.
Yeah. Anything else that you want to share, offer to our participants joining us today as they think about? I remember that we were discussing other question around why are nuances and layers, and we're saying, and what I was sharing with Aditya said, very often we can all write great essays on people practices, right? It's in living them and in that holding the dichotomies and that consistency in practice that makes it really the complex one. And so just wanted to open up space and see anything else that you wanted to offer to you wanted to share with the attendees from your journey.
In their own personal journeys in this direction. I hope it's been useful in some sort of way. I know it's late in the evening and people are probably trading off time with their families or with something else to be here. So I'm grateful for that. I hope it's useful, and India can only develop when I develop. So I hope that each of us is committed to do the work in the direction of compassion. When you see that there's lack of compassion in society, there's no point getting angry. I'll tell you after working 22 years, it's merely a manifestation of what's happening inside my home, with the maid in my house and with my neighbor. And we imagine that, no, I'm a professional working in the social sector. Nothing. It's my personal life has to change. My family life has to change. And as those small units change, it just vibrates out to creating a better society for all of us. So thank you. Thank you for the work that you guys do as ILSS to expand this.
Thank you, Aditya. And thank you to everyone joining us. I think to build India, can we build ourselves? Can we do the inner work ourselves? And everything starts at home, right? And when we say home, literally like home, workplace, and that's really the thought that I'm leaving with. Thank you so much, Aditya, for joining us. Deeply, deeply grateful.